Have you ever held something in your hands, so simple, so ordinary, that it somehow became sacred? In the 1990s, a landline telephone was just that. A weighty piece of beige or gray plastic, with its coiled cord like an anxious snake resting in your lap. It sat on kitchen counters and bedroom side tables. It rang loud. It was always tethered to the wall. And yet, on certain nights, it felt like it held the fate of the entire world in its silence. Especially when you were about to call your crush. Do you remember that feeling? Not the excitement, at least not at first. I mean that other feeling. That quiet, almost suffocating tension that settled in your chest before dialing their number. The room around you stilled. Your hand trembled just slightly. The digits were right there, scribbled in pencil on the back of your school notebook or passed on a crumpled note during lunch. But dialing them, that was something else entirely. The silence in those moments was not like other silences. It was thicker, slower, like air had turned to syrup. It wrapped around you, especially at night, when the house was dim and the only light came from a lamp with a floral shade or the soft blue glow of your digital clock radio. You could hear everything. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the ticking of the clock second by second, measuring how long you hadn't called. Why was it so hard? The phone was right there. You'd picked it up. That was the first brave step. But now your thumb hovered above the rotary dial or the plastic keypad, and in that small pause, just before pressing the first number, it felt like the phone was waiting too. Not just waiting, listening. As if it knew what you were about to do. As if it could hear your racing thoughts. What if they don't answer? What if someone else does? What if they know it's me and they think I'm weird? What if they laugh at me later at school? There was no caller ID to hide behind, no anonymous number or quick text to test the waters. If you called, they would know, or at least their parents would. And oh, the parents. Sometimes it wasn't the fear of your crush answering, but the terror that it might be their dad, a gruff voice saying, "Hello?" like a warning shot. Or their mom, curious and kind, but always asking, "Who's calling, honey?" in a tone that felt like a spotlight. But before all that, there was just the quiet. Do you remember holding your breath in that moment? Like somehow the silence of the room could leak into the phone and betray your nerves? You weren't just dialing a number. You were dialing into possibility, into risk, into hope, into rejection. There were no emojis, no read receipts, no online statuses. It was all or nothing, voice to voice, and every second before that first ring was a trial by fire in your own mind. Did they like you back? Would they be happy to hear from you? Or would they think this was a mistake? Sometimes you'd rehearse what to say, whispering little scripts to yourself, like, "Hey, it's me. I was just wondering if you wanted to maybe hang out this weekend." Then you'd fumble the lines anyway, forgetting your name or saying something stupid like, "Hi, it's your bus seat partner," whatever that meant. The strange thing is, sometimes you didn't even call. Sometimes the silence won. You sat there with the receiver in your hand, the dial tone humming like a gentle dare, and you just couldn't. Why? Because the silence before dialing wasn't just empty space. It was filled with everything you wanted and everything you were afraid of. It was loaded with dreams of holding hands during recess or getting picked as partners in science class, but also nightmares of whispers in the hallway, or worse, being forgotten. That silence made you feel small, but also, strangely, alive. There was a reason we lingered there. It was safer, The moment before the moment held more power than the moment itself, because once you called, you couldn't uncall. Once the ringing began, you were committed. And so, for a long time, you just sat there. Receiver pressed gently to your ear, the cord twisted around your fingers like a lifeline, the hum of the dial tone vibrating against your cheek. Listening, waiting, wondering. Could the phone really hear your thoughts? Maybe not. But in those quiet seconds, it sure felt like it could. Because if it couldn't, then why did you whisper so softly? Why did your heart beat so loud? Why, when even now, decades later, does that memory come back to you, so clear, so sharp, like it was yesterday? That old beige phone is gone now, replaced by touch screens and message threads, by unread messages and typing dots that come and go. But there was something sacred in that fear, something real. Back then, courage meant dialing a number and hoping for a voice. Not a like, not a swipe, a voice. And the silence before it, that was where the real story began.
You'd memorized it, every digit, over and over in your head, like a song lyric or the cheat code to unlock secret levels on your Sega Genesis. You'd read it so many times, it was etched into your memory, like a permanent inscription carved somewhere behind your eyelids. But still, before you dared to dial, you stared at the piece of paper, just in case. It was usually folded, always soft around the edges. Sometimes it was the corner of a notebook page, with faint blue lines behind the ink. Other times it was the back of a class schedule, or a scrap torn from a flyer you picked off a bulletin board in the hallway. Wherever it came from, it was kept safe, tucked inside your backpack, or folded behind a cassette case, or hidden in a drawer next to gum wrappers and old pencils. Do you remember where you kept yours? It might have even been written in gel pen, maybe pink, maybe silver. Something that shimmered a little, something that made the digits feel just a little more enchanted. You told yourself you didn't need to look at it anymore. You knew the number. Of course you did. You had whispered it to yourself walking home from school. You had recited it during commercial breaks between episodes of Boy Meets World and Family Matters. You had mouthed it silently while pretending to read in the back seat of your mom's car. Still, when it came time to dial, your eyes always returned to the paper, because you couldn't risk getting it wrong. In the 90s, there was no margin for error. No back button, no oops, wrong number text to undo a mistake. If you dialed the wrong person, you had to sit there and explain yourself. And if someone else picked up, someone you really didn't want to talk to, there was no turning invisible. Your voice was out there. Your name was already floating in the air. So that slip of paper, it was more than just digits. It was a safety net. A quiet reassurance that you were about to do it right. Even though you knew it by heart, even though you could see the numbers in your mind, you still stared at them. Just one more time. Just to be sure. Have you ever wondered why it felt so sacred? Why the number, just 7 digits, sometimes 10 if you were calling long distance, felt like a secret password? A key to something much bigger? It wasn't just a number. It was a link to a voice that made your stomach flutter, a voice that made the day at school feel different, a voice that made your palms sweat and your words get tangled. It was a portal to a new world where maybe, just maybe, someone liked you back. But it was also dangerous. Because dialing meant vulnerability. It meant showing your hand, saying out loud, without saying it, "I thought about you enough to call." And if the wrong person answered, Or worse, if it went to voicemail and you had to leave a message, a garbled, awkward message. There was no erasing it. That's why the number felt like a spell. One misstep, one misplaced digit, and everything could fall apart. Even writing it down in the first place felt risky. What if someone found it? What if your siblings saw it and teased you? What if your friend asked whose number it was and you couldn't think of a lie fast enough? Keeping it written down was both a comfort and a liability. And yet, you couldn't bring yourself to throw it away. Sometimes, even after you did call, you kept the number for weeks, months, hidden under your pillow, or tucked into your diary, or taped to the inside of a VHS clamshell case. You kept it, long after it was memorized. You kept it because it meant something. It meant you tried, you felt, you dared to care. You didn't always use it, but you looked at it. How many nights did you lie awake, pulling it out just to see those digits again, reading them slowly, imagining the voice on the other end, practicing in your mind what you'd say next time? Hi, it's me, from science class. Or maybe, I was just wondering, did you finish the math homework? Small talk that didn't feel small at all. Sometimes you'd hear a song that reminded you of them, something on the radio, like I'll Be by Edwin McCain, or Kiss Me by Sixpence None the Richer. You'd freeze, your breath would hitch, and your hand would drift, almost instinctively, to that note, still there, still folded, still yours. Did it feel like that for you? Did you ever sit there, alone in your room, carpet beneath your feet, the scent of fabric softener from freshly washed sheets still lingering, and just look at it? The number. Your number. Their number. A portal. A spell. A risk. It wasn't just about calling. It was about believing. Believing that maybe, somehow, your feelings mattered. That the simple act of dialing might open a door to something gentle, something kind. Even now, after all these years, it's strange how clearly we remember it. Not just the number itself, but how it felt to see it. Folded paper, faded ink, your heartbeat in your ears. You'd read the digits again, just to be safe, just in case.
You had the number. You had checked it twice, maybe 3 times. The phone was in your hand again, the cord gently swaying, lightly brushing your leg. The tone was steady. You were breathing like someone trying not to disturb a sleeping baby, even though you were the only one in the room. You knew what you wanted, just to hear their voice. That voice, maybe just for a minute. A simple call, something casual, something that would be over quickly, maybe even forgettable. But then the phone clicked on the other side. And instead of their voice, that gentle, familiar one you'd played over and over in your mind, there came a pause, then a voice. Not theirs. Hello? Not cheerful, not surprised, just adult, dry, tired, maybe a little suspicious. And right then, your stomach dropped. Because this wasn't part of the plan. Why hadn't you considered this? You knew it could happen, of course you did. Everyone had parents, everyone had siblings. But still, you had imagined it going differently. Had you hoped their house would be silent when you called? That the phone would ring just once and be snatched up by the right person? That they'd be waiting for your call, palm already hovering over the receiver like they sensed it? But that didn't happen. Instead, it was someone older, someone who didn't know who you were. Or worse, someone who did. That split second of silence between the hello and your reply was the loudest moment of your day, maybe of your whole week. Your brain scrambled. Should you ask them by name? Should you hang up? Should you disguise your voice? Maybe pretend you dialed the wrong number? Sometimes it was their mom, her voice polite but distant, her tone curious but measured. Can I ask who's calling? Those 6 words were a blade,
because you didn't want to explain who you were. You weren't ready to say your name out loud. You hadn't practiced that part. You hadn't expected to talk to anyone else. It's funny how those little things made such a big difference back then. A simple adult voice asking a question could make your throat close up and your palms turn ice cold. What were you supposed to say? Hi, is Amanda there? You tried to sound casual, like this was normal, like you called people's houses all the time, like you didn't have a trembling notebook open next to you with every possible outcome scribbled in the margins. If it was a dad, their dad, the pressure was even worse, because dads in the 90s had a tone. You know the one. It said, "I'm already suspicious of this call." It said, "Why are you calling my daughter at 8:15 p.m. on a Thursday night?" It said, "I may not say much, but I will remember this voice." And there was nothing more terrifying than that. Sometimes they didn't ask anything, just a flat, "Hold on," followed by silence and then the heavy sound of the receiver hitting a hard surface as they shouted across the house, "Kelly, phone!"
Your heart stopped, because now everyone in their house knew someone had called. And you could hear it, that echo of your name being unknown in a place you wanted to be remembered. Other times, it wasn't a parent at all. It was a younger sibling, loud, curious, sometimes annoying, sometimes sweet, but always a wild card. "Who is this?" You didn't know what to say. You didn't want them to tease. You didn't want them to yell out to the whole house that you had called. Or worse, "She's in the shower. Do you want to leave a message?" Your mind erased. No message. You couldn't leave a message. Your voice wasn't ready. You'd rehearsed your side of the conversation, not a voicemail monologue. I'll call back." And then you'd hang up, fast, face hot, regretting every second of your decision. Do you remember what it felt like after those calls? That stunned silence, holding the receiver like it had betrayed you. That feeling of wishing you could rewind time, crawl backward out of that moment and erase it. Erase your name, your voice, your hesitation. But maybe, just maybe, there were times it worked. Maybe their mom said, "Hang on, I'll get her," in a tone that sounded kind. Maybe their little brother giggled and shouted their name with excitement instead of sarcasm. Maybe one night you did get through. And when they finally picked up, breathless, confused, happy, and said your name like it meant something, like they had hoped it was you, everything else melted away. But still, even on those nights, you never forgot the panic. The first hello that didn't belong to them. Because that fear, it stayed with you. It made you smarter, quieter, a little more cautious next time. You might wait until later to call, hoping the parents were already asleep. Or you might test the waters at school the next day, dropping a vague, "I tried to call last night," just to see if they even knew. But that fear never fully went away. That moment, the second the wrong voice answered, it was one of the purest expressions of teenage vulnerability. All your hopes, all your courage paused in midair. And even now, decades later, it's strange how clearly you can still hear that voice. Not theirs, the other one. "Hello?"
Somehow, after all the waiting, after staring at the number and listening to the dial tone echo in your ear like a countdown to some invisible cliff, you got through. They answered. Their voice, the one you had imagined in 1,000 different versions of this call, was suddenly there, real, breathing on the other end of the line. Close enough to hear, far enough to miss. And yet you almost didn't recognize it, because you weren't ready. Not really. You had rehearsed. You had stood in front of your mirror holding a brush or your TV remote like a phone. You had muttered the lines under your breath during dinner, during commercials, even walking home from school with your Walkman clipped to your belt. You thought you were prepared. But when the moment came, when that precious voice finally said, "Hello?" with a kind of soft curiosity, your mouth dried up, and all that came out was, "Hi." Just one syllable. But it didn't sound like you. It came out cracked, thin, like your voice had to climb up a shaky ladder inside your throat just to get out, and it almost didn't make it. There was a pause. Just a second, but it stretched out wide. Did they notice? Did they hear it? You scrambled to sound casual. That was the goal, wasn't it? Normal, like this wasn't a big deal. Like you hadn't built up this call in your mind all week. Like you weren't sitting on the carpet in your bedroom with the phone cord twisted tightly around your finger, palms sweating onto your knees. "Hey, it's me," you said next, your voice a little too fast, a little too quiet. You hoped they recognized it. You hoped they didn't ask, "Who?" Because how were you supposed to say your name at that point? How were you supposed to force it out through the sudden knot in your throat? Your heart was thudding so loudly it almost covered the silence between your words, and it wasn't the silence of boredom or disinterest. It was the charged silence, the kind that made you wonder if they were smiling, if they were surprised, if they were alone. Maybe they said your name in return. Maybe they sounded glad. Maybe they said, "Hey," like they'd been hoping it was you. But even then, your voice didn't settle. It kept shaking. Not in a way they might comment on, but enough that you noticed. Enough to make your sentences strange, too short or too long, your laugh too loud, your timing just off. You told yourself to breathe, to slow down, to ask something simple, something low risk. Or maybe, "So, did you finish that history project?" Or maybe, "I was just calling to see, if you watched that show last night." Not exactly Shakespeare, but the point wasn't poetry. The point was connection. And still, even as you tried to keep it light, your voice kept betraying you. Do you remember how hot your face would get? As if every nerve in your body had relocated to your cheeks? You could feel it building, like steam rising behind your ears, a heat that pulsed with every beat of your heart.
Your free hand would grip your jeans, or your blanket, or the edge of your desk, just to keep from fidgeting too much. But inside, you were a storm of sweat and static. Your thoughts ran faster than your mouth, and your mouth, well, it was struggling to keep up. You knew what you wanted to say. You wanted to sound cool, calm, unbothered. Like calling them was something you did all the time. Like this didn't matter. But it did. And that was the problem. The more it mattered, the harder it became to mask. Every syllable you forced out had to crawl through the mess of butterflies in your chest. And they weren't gentle. Sometimes you'd try to laugh. That was a trick you picked up. Laugh first, and maybe your voice wouldn't sound so shaky. But even your laugh gave you away. Too quick, too light, too obviously covering for the way your throat was tightening. You were in deep, and you knew it. But here's the thing. They didn't hang up. They stayed. Maybe they even talked back, told a joke, said your name again. And slowly, not all at once, but piece by piece, the panic inside you began to shift. Not disappear, but transform. The heat in your face didn't go away, but it stopped burning. The lump in your throat softened a little. You still stumbled over your words, sure, but now it was part of the rhythm, part of the dance. Because maybe they were nervous too. Maybe their voice shook a little. Maybe you weren't the only one who rehearsed this conversation in their head a dozen times. Maybe they'd even been waiting for the phone to ring just like you'd hoped. Still, it was hard to know for sure. So you kept going, one sentence at a time.
trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. A shared class, a favorite song, something they said last week at lunch, anything to keep the conversation moving, to keep them on the line. Because the longer they stayed, the more real it felt, and the less your voice betrayed you. But you never quite forgot those first few seconds. That first trembling high. That desperate attempt to sound normal when everything inside you was doing cartwheels and warning sirens were blaring in your chest. Even now, when you think about it, you can remember exactly how it felt. The phone cord warm in your hand, your knee bouncing, your voice barely under control, and still, somehow, the words came out. Not perfectly, but enough.
Hi, it's me. That line. So simple, so tiny, and yet when it came out of your mouth, it felt like standing in the middle of a quiet gymnasium, shouting into a megaphone. No one else could hear it, but to you, it echoed with every ounce of tension and hope you'd been carrying all week. You said it. It was done. The words hung there, suspended in the air, between two telephones, as if waiting for permission to land. Then, silence. Not long, not really. A couple of seconds, maybe 3. But in that microscopic space, time rearranged itself. Your brain filled the pause with 1,000 imagined possibilities. Did they recognize your voice? Were they surprised, confused? Were they reaching for something to say? Were they rolling their eyes, smiling? You couldn't see their face, of course. That was part of the magic and the terror of calling someone in the 90s. There were no video calls, no profile pictures or indicators that they were typing, just the disembodied sound of a voice and the wide, wild silence around it. And those first seconds after "it's me," that silence was sacred. Do you remember how still you would sit? Like even the smallest movement might interrupt the flow of the call. Like rustling the phone cord or shifting your weight on the bed could somehow break the connection, or worse, change their answer, because what they said next, or didn't say, had the power to change everything. Sometimes the response was quick. Their voice brightened and you heard something in their tone. Familiarity, relief, a smile you couldn't see but could somehow feel. "Oh, hey, I was hoping you'd call." Just like that, your shoulders dropped. Your breath came back. You smiled too, silently, like it would leak through the line if you let it. Other times, they just said your name. Softly, questioningly, as if they were surprised but not disappointed, testing the sound of it, like trying on a sweater they hadn't worn in a while. That was enough too. But there were those other moments, the ones you tried to forget, when the pause after "it's me" stretched just a little too long, when the air filled with hesitation, or worse, confusion. Who? And even though you tried to laugh it off, even though you responded with your name like it was no big deal, something inside you flinched.
Because you wanted to believe they had been thinking about you, that your voice would be unmistakable, that your call would be a pleasant surprise, not a puzzle to solve. Still, you stayed. You filled the silence, or tried to. "So, how's your night going?" Or, "Did you see what happened in gym today?" Any thread to grab onto, any path away from the awkwardness of the opening. Because what came next, after that fragile, trembling pause, mattered more than anything else. And sometimes, what came next was a miracle. Laughter, easy conversation, jokes that didn't land but still made you both laugh. A rhythm that built slowly, like a song warming up before the chorus. Sometimes they asked you questions. Sometimes they told you things they hadn't told anyone else. Little things, like what their brother had done to embarrass them, or how they'd stayed up too late trying to finish a book for class. Things that sounded ordinary, but felt like treasure. Because if they were talking to you, just you, and telling you things like that, it meant something, right? Even if no one ever said the words, even if nothing official happened, that one call, the voice, the connection, the way your stomach settled into butterflies instead of panic, made everything else feel lighter. School the next day didn't seem as dull. Your backpack didn't feel as heavy. Even the smell of the bus seat, that strange mix of plastic and diesel, was more bearable. But it all started with that line. "Hi, it's me." And the long, eternal pause that followed. Because in that pause lived all your hope. The kind of hope only a 13-year-old could feel, when the whole world seemed to pivot on whether someone smiled at the sound of your voice. You couldn't see them, but you wanted to. You imagined them curled up on their own bed, knees drawn to their chest, twirling the phone cord around a finger the same way you were. Maybe they were staring at a poster on their wall. Maybe they were biting the inside of their cheek to keep from smiling too much. Maybe they were nervous too. And maybe, after all those seconds passed, after the awkward stretch of silence, they smiled. Just a little. Just enough. Because it was you. And they were glad. There were no quiet rooms in a 90s house. Not really. Unless you were lucky enough to have a phone in your room, which most of us weren't, you were stuck near the kitchen, the hallway, the den. Shared spaces where sound was constant and privacy was rare. Even if you did have a phone in your room, the walls were too thin, the doors too hollow. Every word you spoke felt like it echoed. But tonight, you hadn't noticed. Not until the moment you needed the silence most. Now the TV seemed impossibly loud. You could hear Wheel of Fortune from across the house. You imagined them hearing it too, wondering why your mom was shouting out vowels like her life depended on it. "Hang on," you said, covering the receiver and yelling toward the door. "Mom, can you turn it down?" She didn't hear you. Or maybe she ignored you. Or maybe she turned it up just to spite you. Parents had a sixth sense about when you were doing something important that you didn't want them to notice. Then came the worst sound of all. Footsteps. The sound of someone approaching. You tensed. You prayed they'd just walk past. But no. Your mom opened the door. Not a knock, not a warning, just the door swinging wide open with a loud creak. "Who are you talking to?" You stared at her, eyes wide, panic rushing to your face like a rising tide. You covered the mouthpiece with your hand. "Mom, please!" She rolled her eyes. "You've been on for 15 minutes. I know I'm almost done, we'll make it quick." And then she left. Not quietly, of course. She left with a sigh and a closing door that didn't quite latch all the way, so now it sat there slightly ajar like a wound. You brought the phone back to your ear. Pulse still racing. "Sorry," you mumbled. They were quiet for a second. Then, softly, "It's okay." And just like that, the tension melted a little. Because they weren't laughing at you. They didn't hang up. They stayed. And somehow that made all the noise, the dog, the TV, your mom, feel just a little smaller. You'd go on talking for a few more minutes. You'd find your footing again. The awkwardness would settle into something slower, more familiar. But you never forgot how loud the world could be when all you wanted was quiet. How every creak, every shout, every commercial became an intruder in the most delicate moment of your day. You learned how to whisper, how to angle your body away from the door, how to mute your voice when someone passed by. Because the call mattered, even in the chaos.
especially in the chaos. And somehow, that made it even more special.
You were already whispering, not because you wanted to, but because it felt safer that way. Your voice had dropped to a careful hush, like you were reading secrets off a crumpled note under your desk at school. You were choosing words carefully now, weighing what could be said out loud and what had to stay tucked behind your teeth. Because somewhere in the back of your mind, in the part that couldn't fully relax, a little voice whispered louder than your own. What if someone else is listening? It was a real question, a legitimate fear, one that only kids growing up in houses with multiple landline extensions could truly understand. The kind of paranoia that bloomed slowly, usually right around the part of the call when the conversation began to feel comfortable. Because that's when it happened. That was when you were most vulnerable. That's when you started saying things you hadn't planned to say, when the awkward pauses were behind you, when the laughter started to come more freely, when the "so who do you like" questions didn't feel as terrifying, but also when you forgot, for just a second, that anyone in the house could quietly pick up another phone, from the kitchen, the hallway, the upstairs bedroom, and listen. And you'd never know. Unless they slipped, unless the phone clicked, unless they made some little sound that gave them away. So you listened for it. Every few seconds, your ear tuned out of the conversation and into the line itself, listening not to the voice of your crush, but for the click, that subtle shift in the white noise that told you another receiver had joined the line, that unnatural drop in the background hum that meant someone else was there, breathing, listening. Have you ever held your breath mid-sentence just to see if someone else would do the same? You'd pause suddenly. "Wait. What?" they'd ask on the other end. You wouldn't explain, not right away. You'd just sit there, motionless, staring at the floor, eyes wide, heart pounding, trying to decide whether you were being dramatic or actually bugged. Because the trust, it wasn't automatic. You might have trusted your parents in some things. You might have even trusted your siblings in moments. But on calls like these, the trust had boundaries, sharp ones, especially if you'd been caught before. Maybe there had been that one time your older brother suddenly started teasing you about something he shouldn't have known about a name you said on the phone, a story you told, a hope you dared to whisper. And when you asked him how he knew, all he said was, "I heard you," with that smirk, that awful smirk that only older brothers seem to perfect. Or maybe it was your mom. Maybe she picked up from the kitchen while doing dishes and said nothing, just listened, just monitored. She'd say it was for your protection, that she didn't want you talking too long, that she had a right to know. But she didn't understand. She didn't understand what that kind of listening felt like. It was betrayal. It was invasion. It was being caught in a moment you weren't ready to share. That's why, every now and then, you'd pause the conversation and say something vague like, "Hang on, I think I heard something." Then you'd hold your breath. You'd stare at the phone like you could somehow see if someone else was there. You'd imagine the kitchen receiver, the beige one with the slightly sticky buttons, resting off the hook on the counter next to a cup of tea or a folded newspaper. You'd picture someone, a parent, a sibling, hunched next to it, eyes narrowed, ears perked, waiting, recording every word you said. And even if no one was there, the possibility alone was enough to change the call. Your sentences grew shorter, you spoke in code, you gave nicknames to the people you were talking about, you avoided saying anything too vulnerable, too real, too open. Because what if someone was listening? What if you confessed something, even something small like, "I kind of think about you during math class," and someone else heard it? What if they used it against you? Because that was always the fear, wasn't it? Not just that someone might listen, but that they might repeat it. Whispers in the hallway, jokes at the dinner table, teasing that followed you for days. So you learned to be careful.
You never said everything, not on the phone. You said just enough to keep the connection alive, just enough to let them know you cared, but never the whole thing, never the deepest parts. Those stayed locked inside. Maybe that's why handwritten notes felt safer. They couldn't be overheard. But still, even with the risk, you kept calling. Because sometimes, despite the paranoia, despite the fear of someone else quietly breathing into the line, there was nothing like hearing their voice say your name. Nothing like those quiet laughs, the shared silences, the small sparks that made the whole world feel warmer. And in the end, you decided it was worth it. The risk, the silence, the eavesdropping. You spoke in whispers. You trusted your instincts. You watched the phone line like a hawk. And still, you stayed on the call. Because no matter who might be listening, what mattered most was who you were listening to.
You hadn't noticed it at first. In the beginning, all your focus was on the dialing, the number, the voice on the other end. Getting past the awkward hello, getting through the first few minutes without crumbling under the weight of your own nerves. But somewhere in the middle of the conversation, maybe around the point when you started asking real questions, the kind that came with real answers, you felt it. That ache in your chest, that tightness in your ribs, that strange awareness that your lungs were working harder than usual, like they were trying to keep up with the conversation but falling just a step behind. You weren't really breathing, at least not properly. You were managing these shallow, thin sips of air, the kind you take when you're trying not to show emotion, when you're scared of your own heartbeat. You'd speak, maybe a sentence, maybe two, and then your breath would hitch. You'd pause for just a second to refill your lungs, but only halfway, just enough to keep talking. Because taking a deep breath, that felt too loud, too obvious, too risky. You didn't want them to hear it. You didn't want to sound nervous. You wanted to sound smooth, relaxed, effortless. But the truth was, every single word felt like it had to climb a mountain inside your body. And the longer you talked, the more you noticed it. Do you remember counting the seconds? Maybe not out loud, but in your head. You'd test yourself. 1, 2, 3, 4. How far could you get before your breath gave out, before your voice wavered or cracked or turned into that awful, breathless squeak? It wasn't just anxiety. It was tension. Hope wrapped up in muscle. You were holding your breath in case the world shifted, in case they said something that mattered, in case you had to answer quickly, in case they heard you inhale and realized what a mess you really were. It felt safer to run out of breath than to be caught breathing too much. Sometimes you'd forget to breathe entirely, especially during the quiet parts, the waiting parts, the pauses between your question and their answer. Do you want to maybe hang out this weekend? And then silence, a heartbeat, 1,000 heartbeats, and no breath. Because breathing meant you were afraid, and afraid meant you cared, and caring meant something was at stake. So you held your breath and stared at the ceiling, at your shoes, at the old sticker peeling off the edge of your desk, at anything that would hold you together while your lungs screamed for air. And then when they did answer, when they said yes, or laughed, or teased you kindly, you'd exhale. Finally.
Sometimes too fast. Sometimes in a way you couldn't quite control. And maybe they heard it. Maybe they smiled and didn't say anything. Or maybe they asked, "Are you okay?" And you said, "Yeah, just tired," which was only partly true. Because talking to your crush on a landline wasn't just talking. It was an emotional marathon run in a whisper, a careful balancing act between what you felt and what you could safely show. Even your breathing had to be edited. You couldn't just be, you had to perform. And that included how you inhaled and how you let it go. The room didn't help either. It was too hot, too cold, too loud, too quiet.
The carpet prickled your legs, your sock had twisted around your foot in that annoying way, but you couldn't reach down to fix it because it would make noise. You were hunched in a corner, knees up, phone tucked between your shoulder and your ear, trying to sound casual, trying to be calm, trying to remember to breathe. And sometimes you did. Sometimes the conversation turned light, playful. You forgot your fear. You leaned back and laughed. You said something that made them laugh, and in that moment, the tension broke. Your chest loosened, your throat opened, and your breath came back. Real breath, deep breath, the kind that fills your ribs and makes you feel alive again. But it never lasted long, because the next question was always waiting, the next pause, the next silence to survive. And you found yourself counting again. 1, 2, 3, 4. You never really trained for it, but somehow you got better. By the third or fourth call, you could hold a full sentence without gasping. You learned how to time your inhales between words. You discovered how to let out little puffs of air between syllables without them noticing. It became part of the art, the secret skill of the 90s teenage phone caller. It wasn't just about having the courage to dial. It was about endurance. How long could you speak without cracking? How long could you hold your breath before it turned into panic? And looking back, it's almost funny. You weren't running. You weren't hiding. You were just sitting on the floor with a plastic phone pressed to your face. And yet, you were exhausted, flushed, full of adrenaline. Because back then, a conversation with your crush wasn't just about what you said. It was about how you said it. How long you could keep your voice steady. How long you could keep your breathing quiet. How long you could hold your feelings inside your lungs without letting them spill out into the room. And somehow, night after night, you did it. You survived. Not always gracefully, not always smoothly, but enough. Enough to keep calling. Enough to keep hoping. Even when your breath caught in your throat like a secret too big to hold.
It always came too soon. Even when the call had gone well, even when the awkward beginning had softened into something gentler, even when the laughter had come more easily, and your voice no longer felt like it was walking a tightrope between breathlessness and breaking, the ending still arrived like a door closing too hard. Okay, bye. 2 words. So ordinary. So final. And somehow they landed in your chest like a punch you hadn't braced for. Because in that small, quiet moment, right after they said it and right before the line went dead, the whole world seemed to pause. And all you could do was rewind the call in your head, replaying it like a scene from a movie you weren't sure you understood the first time. Had they sounded distant? Had their tone dropped just slightly? Did they really want to hang up? Did you say something wrong? You tried to listen again, not to the words, but to the way they were spoken, the curve of the okay, the softness or sharpness of the bye. If they hesitated even a fraction before saying it, if their voice lifted or fell, if they smiled through it or forced it out or said it too fast. Because that's where the meaning was, not in what they said, but how they said it. You clung to the details, analyzed them. Every syllable was a thread, and you were pulling at it, trying to find the pattern underneath. If they said, okay, bye, with a pause in the middle, maybe that meant they didn't want to go. Maybe something or someone made them end it. A parent calling from the other room, a sibling needing the phone, a sudden wave of shyness that cut the moment short. But if they said it flatly, okay, bye, without pause or emotion, then what? Was that just it? Was the conversation done? Or were you done? You told yourself not to spiral, not to read too much into it, but of course you did. Because back then, a landline call wasn't just a chat. It was a lifeline, a spark, a sign that you mattered to someone. And when that spark went out with 2 quick words into click, it left a strange silence behind. And you sat in it. You stayed there, holding the phone just a little too long after the line disconnected, listening to the dead tone as if something else might come through, as if maybe they'd pick back up, say they forgot to mention something, say they didn't really want to go. But they didn't. No one ever did. So you slowly set the receiver back in its cradle. Gently, always gently. Like slamming it down might break the invisible thread that had just been cut. And then you just sat. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes longer.
Looking around your room like the objects in it might offer answers. The posters on your wall, the stuffed animal on your bed, the notebook with their number still tucked inside. All of them quiet, all of them useless now. Because the only voice that had mattered was gone, and all that was left were your thoughts. You ran back through the conversation again and again, picking apart everything you'd said. Every laugh, every pause, every moment where maybe you talked too much or not enough. You played detective on your own words, as if your future depended on the clues you missed. Maybe I shouldn't have asked that. Maybe they were bored. Maybe they were just being polite the whole time. The worst part was not knowing. The landline didn't give you closure. There was no seen message, no follow-up text to explain, no emoji to soften the blow. Just the silence, and the clock ticking on your nightstand, and your own heart still beating faster than it should have been. Sometimes you'd lie back and stare at the ceiling, replaying their voice over and over, trying to decide if it had sounded warm or cold, trying to hear something new in the way they said, bye. Because what if it did mean something? What if that one word was their way of saying they weren't interested? What if that call was the last one? But sometimes, it didn't feel that way. Sometimes the okay bye came with a softness, a hesitation, a sense that they didn't want to say it either, but they had to. And those were the ones that stayed with you. Those were the ones that made your stomach ache in the good way, the way that felt like hope. Because maybe they were lying in their bed too, staring at the ceiling. Maybe they were holding their breath just like you, wondering what you had meant when you said your goodbye. Maybe they were reliving the call, smiling in the dark, whispering your name to themselves just once before they fell asleep. You never really knew. All you had was the memory and the silence that followed it. And yet, even with the gut punch ending, you kept calling. Because a call like that, even with a quick goodbye, was still more than you had the day before. It was proof. Proof that you were brave enough to dial, brave enough to speak, brave enough to feel something even when you weren't sure what it meant. And somewhere in that silence, somewhere inside the echo of okay bye, there was still the smallest chance that tomorrow night you might call again. Or maybe this time, they'd call you. The room was dark now. The phone was back in its cradle, its hum long gone, its job done for the night. But you were still wide awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, the moonlight drawing soft lines across the walls. Your blanket pulled just high enough to feel safe, but not so high that it smothered you. And in your mind, the call was still happening. Not because it was still playing, it had ended long ago, but because you were replaying it from start to finish, carefully, tenderly, like someone rewinding a tape over and over, trying to catch the tiny details that were easy to miss the first time. You remembered how your fingers had trembled before dialing. You remembered the tightrope walk of that first, "Hi, it's me." You remembered the silence, the laughter, the background noise, the pauses, the way your voice cracked a little when you weren't expecting it to. And then, of course, the goodbye. Okay, bye.
It echoed again, even now, like the line had never really disconnected, like your heart was still on the other end waiting to hear more. But all you had now was the silence and your thoughts. Because that was the thing about nights like these in the 90s. There were no texts to reread, no messages to scroll through for reassurance, no green dots to tell you if they were still awake, thinking about you too. There were no second chances waiting in a notification bubble. What you had was what you had. So you clung to it. You ran through the conversation in your mind like a script. What did they mean when they laughed at that part? Did they pause before saying my name, or was that just in my head? Should I have said more? Maybe it was a perfect little moment. Maybe you got it right. But maybe it was a missed opportunity. Maybe you didn't say what you wanted to say. Maybe you didn't let your voice soften enough when you said goodbye. Maybe you held something back that could have changed the whole direction of the night. You rolled onto your side, the pillow now cool against your cheek, and stared at the faint red numbers of the alarm clock on your nightstand. It blinked 11:52 p.m., ticking steadily toward tomorrow, uncaring, unknowing, while your mind spun in slow, endless circles. And what were you spinning around? Not just the words, but how they sounded, the way they said your name, the rhythm of their breathing, the moment they laughed and didn't explain why, like there was some secret joke only they knew, and maybe you were part of it. The 90s were like that. Everything meant a little more because there was a little less. Fewer chances, fewer ways to communicate, fewer ways to recover if something went wrong. You didn't get to say, "Wait, I didn't mean it like that." You didn't get to add, "Sorry, I was nervous." You didn't get to follow up with a heart emoji or a late night, "Are you still up?"
You got one call, and then you got the quiet. That was it. So you made the most of the quiet. You let your mind build the movie. You filled in their face, the way you hoped they had smiled when you told that story about your teacher mixing up your name. You imagined them lying in bed too, maybe hugging a pillow, replaying the same conversation, wondering the same things. Was it just small talk, or did it mean something more? Sometimes it felt like it did, even if they didn't say anything obvious, even if the call was just 10 minutes, 15 if you were lucky, even if they never said they liked you, never hinted at anything, never asked if you'd call again. Still, there were moments that mattered. The way they didn't rush to hang up, the way they answered your awkward questions without laughing at you, the way they said your name softly, like they were still testing the shape of it in their mouth. And maybe that was enough. Because back then, loving someone, or even liking them, wasn't an announcement. It wasn't a relationship status or a photo with filters. It was quieter, more fragile, more sacred. It was a name written on notebook paper. It was a phone number memorized by heart and still stared at on the page. It was a whisper into a beige receiver, a trembling breath, a laugh shared in the dark. It was courage. To call. To speak. To risk. To care. You turned over again, this time onto your back, eyes tracing the patterns the blinds cast on the ceiling. You sighed, deep this time. Finally. And slowly the movie in your head faded to black. The voices faded. The nerves dissolved. Your thoughts slowed just enough to let sleep find you. But even as your breathing softened, even as your body began to drift, you could still hear it. The click of the phone hanging up, the tone of that final, "Okay, bye," the quiet that came after. And somewhere inside all of that, the call, the silence, the thinking, the hoping, you found a kind of peace. Because even if it didn't go perfectly, Even if you'd never know exactly what they were thinking, you had picked up the phone. You had tried. And, for a few minutes, you had made a connection, real and unfiltered, and trembling with truth. And in the 90s, that was enough to call it love.